7 hills has Rome, 7 mouths has none stream. Around the pole 7 burning planets gleam. Twice equal these is Galway, Connacht Rome. Venice of the West is how Yeats described Galway, and if this is not obvious to the casual observer, one only has to follow any of the streams and waterways that flow into the Claddagh Basin or into the rushing Corrib River itself to discover a tangle of flows and rushes, races and rivers. In his poem Hometown, Kevin Fowler speaks of houses of stone, archways, mill wheels and weirs, and the flowing of waters below, too many years. And for many years, water flows through the arteries, the canals and the waterways, pumping energy into the heart of Galway, feeding its industry, its trade, its culture and social life. It forged a city and directed the lives of its citizens, a city's history etched in every hand-carved stone. Today the 7 rivers abruptly appear and disappear, leaving the unversed flaneur questioning whether the watercourse that springs up along the walk is the distillery, the Gale, the St. Clair, or even the exotically named Madeira. The waterways flow through and by schools and convents, abandoned mills and distilleries. Only the Eglinton Canal itself refuses such subterfuge and defiantly carves and curves its way through the city, ignoring commonly held notions that it is just another relic of old decency. The curious city hiker is rewarded at every turn, if only they take the time to stop and lean over a stone wall.
Well, in ancient times, Galway was known as Streamstown. Obviously, we have this enormous lake, Corrib, up north of the city, and it fed in through the city to the sea. But it came in the form of a whole lot of small streams and rivers. And in fact, a lot of the area that we now know as the city was in fact a whole lot of small islands with these little streams running in between. And ever since, from about the 15th century on, people began to think of the idea of linking the river, the Corrib, and the sea. And this was for commercial purposes now, because there was quite a lot of industry in up on the shores of the lake, around the lake, and there certainly was an awful lot of traffic coming through the docks. And the idea was to link them and maybe to open up a passage for goods coming from the lake to the sea, and therefore they could be exported from there. So as early as the 15th century, as I say, the idea of a canal came up. Initially, they wanted to run it connected from Loch Atalia up through the top of Boher Moor and onto the lake there. The beginning of the 19th century, there was an idea for a canal, and this would have come from Wood Quay. Now, Wood Quay was covered in water in those days. It was part of the lake, in fact. It came right up to what's McSwiggan's pub today. And the idea was to connect from there along the Eglinton Street, as we know it, around the corner and down the side of Eyre Square and connected to the docks there. But this was regarded as probably being too expensive. There would have been a huge amount of blasting to have been done, and also there were a lot of objections from the merchants in that area. So in the end, they decided, Nimmo came up with this idea of a canal on the western side of the city. And this ran from the lake, from the Corrib Rowing Club, as we know it today, down along past Mill Street, past Dominic Street, and connected with what we know as the Claddagh Basin today. He drew up this plan in the early 19th century, and this became a famine project.
So in relation to the canal and this idea of the links between the city and the lake, and the Eglinton Canal is obviously a physical example of that. The story starts back in the 1820s. Behind us, where we are here, we're on the Long Walk in Galway, and across the River Corrib is Nimmo's Pier. Nimmo's Pier is a monument to a magnificent engineer who lived in Ireland about 200 years ago, between the 1810s and 1832. Alexander Nimmo, who came from Inverness, Scotland, a young engineer before the idea of even engineers were known very well in Ireland. He came with Telford and with a lot of these people, and they helped to set up the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, the Office of Public Works, the Geological Survey. They were really very creative people. And when Nimmo was based in Galway, one of the things they realised very quickly, he was working with the commissioners and with the British administration at the time, was that the docks and the fishing industry and the Claddagh here behind us needed to have a safer anchorage, a safer harbour. And so one of the first things he did in 1827, they designed and built the breakwater using stone, limestone that came from the Aran Islands, which is now called Nimmo's Pier ever since. And as well as that, across from us here is the Galway Docks, the Galway Harbour Commissioners, and that was also done to a design from Alexander Nimmo. The next phase of the story then, going on to the idea of the canal, is the canal was proposed at the same time as the pier and the breakwater. So in 1830, Alexander Nimmo and the commissioners here in Galway, they passed an act, and according to this act there was going to be a Galway Harbour Commission set up. It had the power, according to this act, to raise £50,000, which was a lot of money in those days, and the money was for the building of both the docks and also a canal to connect up the sea and Lough Corrib. Nemo's proposals were regarded at the time as too expensive, and they didn't proceed in the beginning in 1830, but the idea continued. And after the Great Famine in the 1840s, there was an attempt in Galway in the early 1850s to revive the fortunes of the town or the city of Galway, and a number of people came together, including a very famous or notorious parish priest in Rahoon, Father Peter Daly, and he worked with the members of the business community in Galway, and they promoted a whole raft of investments in infrastructure in the space of about 5 years. So the first thing, which was the big news that came between 1849 and 1851, the railway came as far as Galway. So it was the age of the railways. At the same time, the university on the banks of the River Corrib was opened. It was called Queen's College. They took in 60 students in October 1849. So you had the railway, you had the university, and then the third big investment was this magnificent hotel was built in Eyre Square called the Railway Hotel. Later it became known as the Great Southern Hotel. And then the fourth major piece of infrastructure and of development was, of course, the Eglinton Canal.
Work started on it in 1848. It employed an awful lot of people. It was a real boon, not just to the economy, but to people's survival during the famine. The canal itself is about 2/3 of a mile long. It is beautifully appointed, I have to say. It's architecturally interesting, just merely the way they've done the stonework and so on. And they came down, they had to purchase the land, obviously, from various people en route, and it came down to the Claddagh Basin. Now, the Claddagh Basin was, it's about 150 yards long, and I'm not quite sure how wide, but it was the link between, there was a lock there at the Claddagh Basin. So it was the actual link between the sea and the river.
So it connects up where we are here, the Claddagh Basin and the River Corrib, and it goes to the west. And it's a magnificent piece of work. Took a couple of years, but it was finally opened officially on the 20th of August, 1852. And here where we are standing, there would have been thousands of people. And the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who was Lord Eglinton, he and his wife came. They had balls and they had salutes from the Navy ships out in the harbour. And there was a great air of optimism in Galway at the time. railway had come, you had the hotel, you had now this new canal linking the city and Lough Corrib.
The canal opened up a huge amount of the city. Now, in addition to the canal being built, at the same time, they lined the riverbank. They focused what we called Streams Town. They took away a lot of the streams and focused it into the river as we know it today, with the exception of quite a number of mill races and tail races, which became very instrumental in powering industry. Nuns Island in the 19th century would have been the kind of industrial estate of Galway, if you like. There was a lot of industry there, and all of which were powered by these mill races, tail races, and of course the river itself. Initially, the canal became very busy commercially. For the first time, for example, there used to be several hundred tons of seaweed brought into Galway docks every year. This was to be processed and turned into iodine and whatever else they could make. But that number of boats choked up the docks. And so obviously the Harbour Board wanted to free up the docks for commercial. So suddenly these boats could now travel up the canal and to the area which we know as the Iodine today, which is about a mile upriver, just past Menlo Castle. there were a number of mines around the coast of the lake, and suddenly they could now bring their product down the canal and out to the sea and connect with boats so that this material could be exported and so on. So it had a huge impact commercially on the city life. And it was so they built, for example, steamers, quay. The whole waterways system was transformed within a period of about 5 years. And it changed Galway. It had a very dramatic impact on Galway and on the landscape in this city.
The idea of the various business people and Father Daly was that you would bring together the railway, the docks, the canal, and try and bring prosperity to the city. But in actual fact, when you look at it right through to the end of the 19th century, they didn't achieve these grandiose plans. The canal didn't greatly affect the lives of ordinary people in the hinterland of Galway. It was mostly really to benefit the people of the city. Its reign was short-lived. It was more useful, the city, in terms of its water power, rather than any major trade to the heartland of Galway. And so, right through until the middle of the 20th century, most of the traffic up and down Lough Corrib were actually steamers. Lord Ardlon was bringing people from Galway up to Cong and back again, and boating and cruises and so on. And then commerce, bringing cattle back and forth across the lake, for example, between Moycullen and Headford. But the canal never achieved, let's say, the success. But a number of years later, an English tourist came, and this is described very well in a book by John Cunningham, another historian from Galway. He calls Galway a town tormented by the sea. That's the title of the book. But according to this visiting English person who wrote at the time, so Galway has this magnificent hotel, has the railway, has the docks, and now has the canal, but there's very little business going on. So that was the challenge. It was after the famine and the Crimean War. Ironically, 200 years later, we're still talking about wars in the Crimea. But at that time, there was a downturn in international trade because of the Crimean War. And so it was difficult to get business. And actually, the economic prosperity of, let's say, the hinterland of Galway was limited to wool and hides and marble, Connemara marble, and then here in the city, Perce's distillery. So they were the main exports from Galway, but it wasn't possible to justify the whole investment in the canal and in the harbour just for those. When you look now from the air down at Galway city, you'll see the architecture of all these great rivers, but it's from a bygone era, and it's something we should be proud of, but it probably never fully achieved the dreams of.
As a feat of engineering, the canal and the Claddagh Basin are hugely significant and important, of historic importance. So I would say that gradually the traffic on it ceased. It became choked with weeds and stuff like that. Then an interesting thing happened in the 60s. A lady called McHugh, Mrs. McHugh, who lived on the canal, she got fed up with all of this neglect. So she got a bunch of local kids and they began to landscape the sides of the canal. And suddenly it looked a lot more different, much more attractive. People suddenly realized, oh my God, in the middle of town, you know, all those shrubs and flowers, doesn't it make the place look very pretty and decorative and so on? And then they began to clean up the canal. And so today it is used quite a bit for canoeing, kayaking, that kind of thing.
Industry continued to grow slowly. Here where we are now, and the Long Walk, as it's called, just on the east bank of the Corrib, you had in the 1860s and 1870s a very large enterprise based on seaweed. It's very interesting because 200 years later we're still talking about seaweed as a resource, and we have a seaweed factory in Connemara in Kilkierden. But at that time, in the 1870s, an engineer called McIntyre had to develop the process for extracting iodine from seaweed. So the seaweed was gathered on the shores of Connemara, brought in here. They had these big tanks and vats. They were letting the seaweed decompose, and then they had a chemical process for extracting iodine, which was very valuable at the time, and that was exported from Galway. And later on, sulfuric acid and different chemicals were produced. But the residents here in the Long Walk weren't impressed. There was a smell, there was a bad smell. So later on, some of the work moved to Terryland, at woolen mills, and we had whiskey. So there was a certain resurgence. But never to the scale that was envisioned by Father Daly.
I was reared in Nuns Island, and all of that area around there was our playground. The mills were the best playground in Europe, and with the bridge mills and with head races and tail races and canals, waterways all the way around, like, you know. There was a James Mahan, civil engineer, and he made a proposal to the establishment at that time to build a dike up the Dyke Road, and to raise the level of the water upstream of the weir, and horsepower to the mills in Galway, and then to provide navigation from the lake down to the open sea. And at one stage, they proposed to bring two locks in that area, but discovered that with the amount of rock, that was more economical to put in one big lock, one deep lock. So upstream of the lock gate then was the head race, and below it was the next lock then would be down at the Claddagh Basin.
whenever there was traffic. Because obviously a 14-foot drop had to be very carefully managed in terms of the lock. And so it was a very important job and a very important part. So the lock keeper, whose work was very significant in the maintenance of the canal, he had a house on Ball's Bridge, as it's known, the end of Dominic Street, just beside the Park of Ayr lock there. And he operated that. So, as I say, it was very important. I have no idea when the last lock keeper was there. I would say it was probably in the 20s, maybe into the 30s, but not since. Obviously, the job became redundant when they sealed the bridges and the lock was no longer operative then. It was worn down by the water eventually, I think, you know. It's a very attractive waterfall feature now in the middle of the city. I think it adds considerably to just the general ambience of the whole area there. But it no longer functions as a lock.
And one of the areas down there then was called the Madeira. It was a new word to us. We didn't know where it came from, but I have a good idea where it came from now. But anyway, we got this a great warmth from that area, and I still have it. Every time I come into town on Friday, I walk up by the water on the left-hand side and the right-hand side and all over. But and I remember at one stage then, the ESB were building a substation adjacent to the canal on Canal Corporation property. And in the process then they had to lay high tension cables in Pump Lane. And I got involved in it either by design or by accident. And I discovered in the excavations the remains of steps, stonework going somewhere, and they kindly facilitated us, the corporation, and we discovered the steps that were leading from Pump Lane down for people to use for washing clothes and getting water from the canal, from the river below the canal. Because when the canal was built there, opened there in 1853, they had a towpath at the side of the canal where the horses would pull the barges up through the canal, and then they've cut off the access to the river where people were taking water for consumption or whatever. So they had to put in steps then to facilitate that. And let the wastewater go out onto the towpath, and then they had to build a culvert from the wash area upstream of the lock gates, and to get water from the canal, and that's probably why they call it Pump Lane. The water will be pumping out there by gravity, but it's called Pump Lane. So then later on, then whilst we were there, I discovered a shoeing flag, which was for putting iron tyres onto wooden wheels that have heated up the iron tyre with a turf fire, and then put it onto the wheel. Put it onto the wheel that was made locally, and so it's a very important part of Galway.
was a drop of about 14 feet in this, and that was the only other lock, the one to the sea and the one to go up the 14 feet. There were 5 bridges built, all of which were swivel bridges. These were hand operated, so you could hand operate and turn the bridge, open it up so that boat traffic could travel up and down the canal. And this continued until the 1930s and 40s. And at that stage, there was virtually no commercial traffic whatsoever on the canal. And so the corporation came to a decision to seal the bridges, which they did at that time. But up to then, they had been, as I say, hand-operated swivel bridges. They collected a lot. There was a toll, a commercial toll on the canal. And in the early 19th century, in 1 year, they collected almost £1,000. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but that would translate into several £100,000 today. So it was a lot.
There's 2 lockkeepers' houses built along the canal. One at Downing Street, which is still there, and the lockkeeper there would control the Claddagh Basin, the lock gates of the Claddagh Basin, and also the swivel bridges at Ball's Bridge, which is now Downing Street, and the second lockkeeper's house then was up at beside Johnny Ward's, and that house was demolished. And the lockkeepers' houses then were built with granite that was excavated when they were building the canal, and it's a great mixture of history and utilisation. Lough Corrib Navigation Trustees have abandoned navigation when they put in the fixed bridges going back in the early 50s. Navigation was abandoned, but the trustees were still involved in the maintenance. And then the Office of Public Works and Galway Corporation and the navigation trustees, they're all working in unison.
There were a number of distilleries in Galway at the beginning of the 19th century. They kept changing hands anyway, for one thing, and sometimes they closed down. Peirce bought this, what had been a flour mill, in fact, and then became a distillery. He bought it. He had one up on what was called, and still is called, Distillery Road. But he bought this place, which was on a fork in between the river and a tail races, and very strategically placed for an industry. And it was powered completely by water. In the 50s, we, as members of Galway Swimming Club, when we got to a certain level in competitive swimming, we needed training, a different kind of training to what we were getting in the sea. There were no pools here. So we used to go to the canal. we used to go to the bridge at Johnny Ward's shop, undress there and swim up the canal to or past the pillars, which was very, very difficult against the current. And what I remember particularly is you had to get used to the weeds literally winding themselves around your legs and so on, and not panic, you know. On very wet days, we had permission from IMI, which was a munitions factory, which is where the student bar is today in college. But they used to make munitions there. We could tog in and out there. And when you got out of the canal, you were probably frozen. It was pouring rain. And you just walked in and you just stood in front of the furnace and turned around, and you didn't need a towel at all. It was a wonderful feeling.
The water wheel that got built at the Garda station, Parkavira, had been made by Anco in association with the Galway Corporation, and the civil engineering works for that were very obvious there, very obvious, and it was a great opportunity to put in a water wheel. The Bish, where the St. Joseph's Seminary is now, I remember that water wheel working, and I can remember the foundry hammer working probably all during the war.
And the other great character who comes into the story then of Galway and the canal and the business of the town was a man from Counternanillan in Connemara called Martin Moore MacDonagh. And he's worthy of a book in his own right. And that book has also been written by Pat Sheeran. But Martin Moore came into Galway in the 1850s. First of all, he was the foreman in the sawmills, and then his family married into the Comerford family, became wealthy, became, we'll say, the bourgeoisie of Galway. And Martin Moore was one of the most powerful men in Galway between the 1860s and the end of the 19th century. And we saw on our tour during August this year the area where they had the turbines, and he was producing batteries, so power for the town of Galway. And the MacDonagh name still lives on in the history of Galway.
Motorised transport, so for example, trucks and lorries and vans were now coming on the road. and they could be much quicker than boats. They could also carry quite heavy loads and so on. So unfortunately, from a commercial point of view, it became outdated. And by the end of the First World War, there was virtually no commercial traffic on it at all. And at that stage, there was no kind of leisurely traffic, no traffic for fun on it, apart from a couple of rowing clubs that were on the canal. There was UCG Rowing Club, there was Corrib Rowing Club, there was the Royal Yacht Club. There were 3 of them on the canal, but otherwise there was no kind of leisure traffic on it at all. Yeah, at the end of the 19th century, this family started a little electricity business on the side, on the canal, in fact. Well, not on the actual canal, on the side of the river in Nuns Island. And this was a new form of power. And as electricity became more accessible to the general public, and particularly to industry and commerce and business, they began to use it instead of relying on the waterways. So what would have been a feature of the city for many years would have been major water wheels, obviously dotted around the place. There's only 1 or 2 left now, excuse me, and they're not functioning anymore. They're decorative. There is one in the Bridge Mills, which I think can be worked today. But you're quite right in that it did power at least 30 businesses and mills. Now, these would have been flour mills, there was munitions factories, there was factories making whiskey. You know, there were a whole lot of, it was a major variety of smallish industries, but all using the power of the river. And often when I look at it today, the river, thinking, oh my God, why don't we use that power even today? You know, wouldn't it light up at least half the town? Since then, since they sealed the bridges, the canal, it's been a beautiful part of Galway, I always think. It's an important kind of lung. It had a very important influence on floodwaters in Galway. Up until the time that they built the canal, quite a lot of the area, all around the Headford Road, for example, was very prone to flooding during the winter. But the canal eased all of that. It took away all of that impact of flooding. So it was a big improvement for environmentally. It also meant that, for example, Wood Quay, as we know it today, was gradually filled in. So there was some interesting land reclamation going on as well.
And the reason you can't provide water is that is the control systems on the waterways is non-existent. They're all fixtures, and to control water when the main weir, the weir that regulates water down the main river, they have to take cognizance of the level of the Lough Corrib itself and the flooding out in the catchment area. and that gets priority over everything else, and rightfully so. But there's need for some sort of a system of providing water and controlling it on the rest of the waterways, and all of that is all very feasible. It's all very doable, but I feel that there's not enough attention being paid to it. We're sitting on a gold mine in Galway, a unique combination of waterways for amenity.
Now, it was an important breathing space, a kind of like a lung running up through the middle of the city, if you like, and still is, hugely significant, even more so probably today. It was impeccably well built, so it's going to last for a very, very long time.
I said the best raw water in Europe coming down to Corrib, and all we have to do is utilise it for water supply and for amenity value.
Claddagh Basin, that had some very serious problems initially, like, for example, seepage of water, but they managed to take care of that. All of the material that they excavated out of the Claddagh Basin, they used that to fill in behind the stonework of the basin, and they also used it to fill in the kind of area in front of UCG, which they were building at the same time. Between all of those construction works, it must have been a very change to Galway physically from 1845 to 1855. But there were people who made bottles, they made corks, they made barrels. There was all kinds of little minor groups and industries associated with it. So when it closed, it had a very major impact, economic impact on the city. And nothing has really replaced it since. Now, I know that UCG have some kind of a plan to develop this building, and I hope they do, because it's lovely. The building is still intact. It has had at least 2 fires there. I remember one in the 50s, particularly because it lit up the whole town. But it was very strategic and made maximum use of the power of the river and the canal.
the rivers and the lakes stayed with the estates. But the estates were at this stage long gone. The landlords had left and gone to England or America and so on. And gradually now the work is to try and restore that jigsaw of ownership. But to take, for example, Lough Corrib, you have a number of different state agencies that have responsibility. The Lough Corrib Navigation Trust is Galway County Council, Galway City Council, where we are here, Mayo County Council, together setting up a structure that exists in law, which is responsible for navigation. But they only have a limited amount of responsibility. The Office of Public Works, which was set up by people like Nimmo in the 1830s, that's responsible for drainage and for trying to keep the rivers clear, as they call it. And then you have a number of other agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for environmental management in the broad sense in the country, including water quality. But inland fisheries, they have a lovely place here in Galway, are responsible for actually the fisheries. So not the water, but the fish. So there's 4 different state agencies. One of the aspirations that we would have in Corrib is to try and create a Corrib forum whereby the county councils and those state agencies would meet together and have a more democratic approach to looking at the future of Lough Corrib for the benefit of the people of Galway.
The problems associated with our world is this disconnect with nature itself. And what we're trying to do in Galway through the National Park City is to bring all sectors together. Now, sometimes people can feel, what can we do in Galway? We're a little city of waterways in terms of our rivers and in terms of our canals. And 20 years waterways rather than adopt them and integrate them into the fabric. So what we did then was rename a new park, the Terryland River Valley Park. To this Terryland Forest Park, as it's now called, is the wetlands, is the woodlands, is the river, is all of these different types of habitats right in the heart of a city. So if it can happen in Galway, it can happen anywhere. So I look at this as an inspiration, and I look at, as I say, what's happening across the rest of the world, where there's progressive activities taking place. Now we feel that the local government here is not doing enough. It looks on, sadly, the environment has in opposition to development. There can be no more sustainable development without the integration of the blue and green. And we have this beautiful fabric of blueways and greenways in Galway. So where you're standing isn't just about the rivers, it's also about, it's where the Connemara Greenway will begin. It's where the greenways from Headford should be coming into the city, where Oranmore should be coming into the city. So again, no more, there is no future without the integration of blue and green. And blueways, when you think of blueways, all our cities, major cities in the world, start at rivers, start at lakes, start in seashores. And Galway is unique of having all of those 3. We have here the River Corrib, Lough Corrib, Lake Corrib, and we also have Galway Bay. So we have these fantastic natural resources that no longer should we consider as issues that should be built into, but issues that we should integrate into the rest of the city. And for too long, green areas in cities were looked on as land banks to be built on, to be covered in concrete, to be covered in tarmac. And we have to reimagine this is the waterways itself, the Corrib on one side and the Terryland River flowing through it.
Lough Corrib, the second largest lake in the island of Ireland after Lough Neagh, is almost hidden. In other words, it's forgotten. It's hidden from view in the middle of this beautiful county. And we think it's a magnificent resource. People should be more aware of it. And if we're more aware of it and are using it more, then we would look after it better from the point of view of water quality.
So it's being used a lot more today. I think people are a lot more aware of its importance from an environmental point of view and from maintaining it as a clean kind of waterway, not allowing all of those weeds, etc., to develop again. There may be areas of it where it has become a bit overgrown. At the back of the cathedral heading to Nuns Island, for example, is one. But overall, it's very clean and it's a very significant and important part of the city.
Oh, the crossbones of Galway, the hollow grey houses, the rubbish and sewage, the grass-grown pier, and the dredger crumbling all night in the harbour. The war came down on us here. Salmon in the Corrib, gently swaying, and the water combed out over the weir, and 100 swan dreaming on the harbour. The war came down on us here.